Marcus Sullivan stood at the edge of the military recruitment fair, watching young men and women mill around the various booths with their freshly pressed uniforms and eager faces. At 42, he felt ancient compared to these kids who barely looked old enough to drive, let alone handle the realities of military service. His weathered hands, scarred from years of handling weapons and climbing ropes, hung loosely at his sides as he observed the scene with the quiet intensity that had become second nature during his 12 years as a Navy SEAL. The recruitment fair was held at the local community college, and Marcus had only stopped by because his daughter Sarah was considering joining the Air Force after graduation. She had asked him to come along for moral support, though he suspected she really wanted his professional opinion on the recruiter's promises. Sarah was his pride and joy, the one good thing that had come from his marriage to Linda before it fell apart under the weight of his frequent deployments and the invisible wounds he carried home from Afghanistan and Iraq. "Dad, look at this," Sarah called out from the Navy booth, where a young petty officer was explaining the benefits package with rehearsed enthusiasm. Marcus walked over, his movements fluid despite the chronic pain in his left knee from a parachute landing gone wrong in Kandahar. The petty officer, whose name tag read Peterson, looked up at Marcus with the kind of respect that came from recognizing someone who had been where he hoped to go. "Sir, were you military?" Peterson asked, straightening his posture slightly. "Navy," Marcus replied simply. He had learned long ago that less was more when it came to discussing his service. The details of his deployments, the missions that remained classified, and the friends who didn't make it home were not topics for casual conversation at a recruitment fair. As they moved through the various booths, Marcus noticed a group of young men gathered around the Army Rangers table. They were the type he recognized immediately, athletic, confident to the point of arrogance, and completely convinced of their own invincibility. Their leader, a tall kid with the kind of swagger that came from being the star quarterback in high school, was regaling the others with stories about his plans to become an elite soldier. "I'm telling you guys," the kid was saying, "I've been shooting since I was 8 years old. My dad says I'm a natural. These military guys won't be able to teach me anything I don't already know about handling weapons." Marcus paused, pretending to read a brochure while listening to the conversation. Sarah noticed his sudden stillness and followed his gaze. She had seen this look before, usually when someone was about to say something particularly foolish in her father's presence. The young man, whose name appeared to be Jake based on his friend's responses, continued his monologue. "My uncle was in the Army back in the day, and he told me all about basic training. It's mostly just mind games and yelling. The real challenge is the physical stuff, and I've been working out since middle school. I can bench press 300 pounds. One of his friends, a shorter kid with acne scars, chimed in. "What about the shooting tests? I heard they're pretty tough." Jake laughed, the sound carrying that particular note of youthful arrogance that made Marcus's jaw tighten. "Please. I've been hunting with my dad since I could hold a rifle. Last weekend, I hit a deer from 200 yards with iron sights. These military instructors are probably just weekend warriors who couldn't hack it in the real world anyway." The Army Ranger recruiter, a staff sergeant named Williams according to his uniform, was doing his best to maintain his professional demeanor, but Marcus could see the irritation building in the man's eyes. Williams had probably heard variations of this speech 1,000 times from cocky teenagers who thought their high school football trophies and hunting trips qualified them for special operations. "Well," Williams said diplomatically, "confidence is important, but military marksmanship is quite different from civilian shooting. We teach precision under pressure, often in conditions that would surprise most civilian shooters." Jake's smirk widened. "Pressure? Man, you should see me in the fourth quarter with 20 seconds left on the clock. I thrive under pressure. Besides, how hard can it be to hit a target when you're just lying there with all the time in the world?" Marcus felt Sarah's hand touch his arm gently, a gesture she had learned to use when she sensed her father was about to correct someone's misconceptions about military service. She had inherited his sense of justice, but had also learned to recognize when his patience was wearing thin. "Maybe we should look at the Coast Guard booth," Sarah suggested quietly, hoping to steer her father away from the brewing confrontation. But Marcus was already moving toward the group, his footsteps silent despite his size. Years of moving through hostile territory had taught him to control every aspect of his physical presence, and when he wanted to approach unnoticed, he could do so with ghost-like efficiency. The conversation continued as Marcus drew closer. Another young man had joined the group, this one wearing a Letterman jacket from the local high school. "Jake's right," the newcomer said. "My brother went through basic training last year, and he said the shooting was the easiest part. They give you all these fancy scopes and equipment. It's not like you have to be some kind of sniper or anything." Williams was beginning to look genuinely frustrated now. As a veteran of 2 deployments to Iraq, he understood the vast difference between the romanticized version of military service these kids carried in their heads and the harsh realities of combat. But his job was to recruit, not to lecture teenagers about the complexities of warfare. "The military does provide excellent training and equipment," Williams said carefully, "but I think you might be underestimating the challenges involved. Military marksmanship standards are quite rigorous." Jake laughed again, louder this time. "Rigorous? Come on, Sergeant. I bet I could outshoot half the guys in your unit right now. Give me any rifle you want, and I'll show you what real shooting looks like." It was at that moment that Marcus stepped into the circle of young men, his presence suddenly filling the space like a storm cloud moving across a sunny sky. The conversation died abruptly as the teenagers took in his appearance, the quiet confidence, the watchful eyes, and the way he seemed to occupy more space than his physical size should allow. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of leading men in life-and-death situations. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about military marksmanship standards." Jake, to his credit, didn't back down immediately. The confidence of youth and inexperience still burned bright in his eyes. "Yes, sir. I was just telling the sergeant here that civilian shooters can be just as good as military ones. Maybe better, since we don't have to follow all those rules and regulations." Marcus nodded slowly, as if considering the statement seriously. "That's an interesting perspective. My dad started teaching me on his ranch. I've probably fired more rounds than most soldiers ever will." "And you feel confident that you could outshoot active-duty military personnel?" The challenge in Marcus's tone was subtle but unmistakable. Jake's friends shifted nervously, sensing that they had wandered into deeper waters than they had intended. But Jake himself seemed oblivious to the danger, his ego preventing him from recognizing the predator that had just entered their midst. "Not to be disrespectful," Jake said, his chest puffing out slightly, "but yeah, I think I could hold my own against anyone in uniform. Shooting is shooting, whether you're in the military or not." Marcus turned to Sergeant Williams, who was watching the exchange with growing interest. "Sergeant, does your recruiting station have access to a shooting range?" "Yes, sir," Williams replied, suddenly more alert. "We use the indoor range at the police training facility for demonstration purposes. It's just a few miles from here." "And you have equipment available for demonstrations?" "Standard M4 carbines, yes, sir. We use them to show potential recruits what they'll be training with." Marcus looked back at Jake, his expression neutral but his eyes carrying a weight that made the young man shift uncomfortably for the first time. "Would you be interested in a friendly demonstration?" "Nothing official, just a chance to see how civilian marksmanship compares to military standards?" Jake's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. His friends were looking at him expectantly, waiting to see if he would back down from his bold claims. The moment stretched out like a held breath, and Marcus could see the exact second when pride overrode common sense in the young man's mind. "Sure," Jake said, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat and tried again. "Sure, I'd be happy to show you what I can do." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. It was the smile of a professional who had just accepted a challenge that he knew he would win before it even began. "Excellent. Sergeant Williams, would it be possible to arrange this demonstration today?" Williams glanced at his watch and then at the growing crowd of onlookers who had been drawn by the tension in the conversation. Word was already spreading through the recruitment fair that something interesting was happening at the Army booth. "I think I can make some calls. Give me 20 minutes. As Williams stepped away to coordinate the demonstration, Marcus turned his attention back to Jake and his friends. The young man was trying to maintain his confident facade, but Marcus could see the first signs of doubt creeping into his expression. It was a look he had seen before, usually on the faces of new recruits during their first live-fire exercise, when they realized that everything they thought they knew about shooting was about to be tested under very different circumstances. So, Marcus said conversationally, what's your preferred shooting position? Standing, kneeling, or prone? I usually hunt from a tree stand, Jake replied, some of his earlier bravado returning, but I'm comfortable shooting from any position. Standing is actually harder, so I practice that a lot. Good thinking. And what's the longest shot you've made successfully? About 300 yards, maybe a little more. Hit a buck clean through the heart last season. Marcus nodded appreciatively. That's solid shooting. Hunting definitely requires precision and patience. Of course, game animals don't typically shoot back, but the fundamentals are the same. The comment was delivered so casually that it took a moment for its implications to sink in. Jake's friends exchanged glances, and Marcus could see them beginning to reassess their friend's chances in the upcoming demonstration. The excitement in their faces was gradually being replaced by concern. Sarah appeared at Marcus's elbow, having watched the entire exchange from a distance. "Dad," she said quietly, "what are you doing?" "Just helping a young man understand the difference between confidence and competence," Marcus replied without taking his eyes off Jake. "Education is important, don't you think?" Before Sarah could respond, Sergeant Williams returned with a satisfied expression. "All set. The range is available, and I've got transportation arranged. We can head over whenever you're ready." The crowd around the Army booth had grown considerably, with students and other recruiters alike drawn by the prospect of witnessing what was clearly shaping up to be an interesting competition. Word had spread that a civilian was challenging military marksmanship standards, and the story had grown in the telling until half the fair was buzzing with anticipation. Jake looked around at the expectant faces and realized that he had painted himself into a corner. Backing down now would be social suicide, but going forward with the demonstration was beginning to feel like a very different kind of mistake. He squared his shoulders and tried to recapture his earlier confidence. "Let's do this," he said, his voice carrying more conviction than he felt. As the group prepared to leave for the shooting range, Marcus pulled Sarah aside. "I want you to understand something," he said quietly. "This isn't about humiliating that kid. He's got courage, and that's worth something. But he's also got dangerous misconceptions about what military service involves. And those misconceptions could get him or his future teammates killed if they're not corrected." Sarah studied her father's face, seeing the mixture of frustration and genuine concern that drove his actions. "You could have just walked away." "Yes, I could have. But then he would have gone into basic training thinking he was hot stuff, and some drill instructor would have had to break him down a lot harder than I'm about to. This way, maybe he learns the lesson without having to fail in front of his entire platoon." The convoy of cars that formed to head to the shooting range included not only the main participants, but also a dozen curious onlookers who had decided that this was more interesting than any of the official recruitment presentations. Marcus rode in Williams' car, listening to the sergeant's questions about his background. "If you don't mind me asking," Williams said as they drove through the afternoon traffic, "what's your experience level? I can tell you've been in the service, but—" 12 years Navy, Marcus replied. "Special operations. 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Iraq." Williams glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his respect evident. "SEALs?" "Yeah." The single word carried enough weight to explain everything. Williams nodded and focused on the road, understanding now why Marcus had been so confident in accepting Jake's challenge. SEAL snipers were legendary within the military community, their training and skills representing the absolute pinnacle of military marksmanship. At the shooting range, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The facility's owner, a retired Marine named Rodriguez, had agreed to oversee the demonstration and ensure safety protocols were followed. He set up targets at 50 yards, a distance that would be challenging enough to demonstrate skill differences without being impossible for a civilian shooter. Jake examined the M4 carbine that Williams had brought, turning it over in his hands with the careful attention of someone who understood firearms. "Nice weapon," he said, his earlier nervousness giving way to genuine interest in the equipment. "My dad's got an AR-15 that's similar to this." "The M4 is a good rifle," Marcus agreed, accepting his own weapon from Williams. "Reliable, accurate, easy to maintain. The military's been using variants of this platform for decades." As they prepared for the demonstration, Rodriguez explained the rules. Each shooter would fire 5 rounds at a standard bullseye target from a standing position at 50 yards. No scopes, just iron sights. They would alternate shots, with Jake going first to eliminate any advantage that might come from observing the other shooter's technique. The small crowd gathered behind the firing line, their conversation dying to whispers as the demonstration began. Jake took his position, the rifle comfortable in his practiced hands. He had been shooting for most of his life, and despite his growing nervousness about the competition, he knew he was genuinely skilled with a rifle. His first shot rang out across the range, the sharp crack echoing off the concrete walls. Through the spotting scope, Rodriguez called out the hit. Good shot, just outside the 9 ring at 2 o'clock. Jake smiled, some of his confidence returning. It was a solid hit, the kind of shooting that had made him the star of his high school's shooting club. He glanced at Marcus, who was watching with the same neutral expression he had maintained throughout the afternoon. Nice shooting, Marcus said genuinely. Good sight picture, smooth trigger pull. The second shot was even better, landing squarely in the 9 ring. Jake's friends erupted in cheers, their faith in their friend's abilities restored by his strong showing. Even some of the military recruiters nodded appreciatively at the young man's skill. By the time Jake had completed his 5 shots, he had managed a very respectable grouping with 4 shots in the 9 and 10 rings, and 1 barely outside. It was the kind of shooting that would have earned him a high score in any civilian competition, and his confidence had returned in full force. Not bad for someone who's never had military training, he said, setting down the rifle with obvious satisfaction. Marcus stepped up to the firing line, his movements economical and precise. There was no wasted motion as he raised the rifle, no fumbling with the controls, or uncertainty about the weapon's handling. He had fired tens of thousands of rounds through similar rifles, and the M4 felt like an extension of his body. The first shot came so quickly that several observers jumped at the unexpected speed of his engagement. There had been no lengthy aiming process, no visible adjustment of stance or breathing. Marcus had simply raised the rifle, acquired the target, and fired in one smooth motion that took perhaps 2 seconds from start to finish. X-ring, dead center, Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying a note of surprise. The crowd fell silent, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something far beyond normal marksmanship. Marcus's second shot followed within seconds of the first, the rifle barely seeming to move between engagements. X-ring, touching the first shot. Jake's smile faded as he watched Marcus work. There was no drama, no showmanship, just the methodical precision of someone who had spent years perfecting their craft under the most demanding conditions possible. The third and fourth shots followed in rapid succession, each one placed with surgical accuracy in the exact center of the target. When Marcus fired his fifth and final shot, the entire sequence had taken less than 30 seconds. Rodriguez studied the target through his spotting scope for a long moment before announcing the results. 5 shots, all X-ring hits. Grouping size approximately 1 inch. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft whistle of wind through the range's ventilation system. Jake stared at the target in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. His own shooting, which had seemed so impressive moments before, now appeared amateurish by comparison. Marcus set down the rifle and turned to face the young man, his expression serious but not unkind. "You're a good shot," he said simply. "Better than most civilians I've seen, but there's a difference between being good at something and being ready to stake your life on it." The drive back to the recruitment fair was markedly different from the excited convoy that had departed an hour earlier. Jake sat in the passenger seat of his friend's car, staring out the window, with the 1,000-yard stare that came from having one's worldview fundamentally altered in the space of 30 seconds. His friends, unsure how to process what they had witnessed, filled the silence with nervous chatter about how impressive both shooters had been, carefully avoiding any mention of the vast gulf in skill they had just observed. Marcus rode with Sergeant Williams again, but this time the conversation was more substantial. Williams had been genuinely impressed by the demonstration, not just for the shooting itself, but for the way Marcus had handled the entire situation. There had been no gloating, no humiliation of the young civilian, just a quiet demonstration of professional competence that spoke volumes about both his skill and his character. "That was some shooting," Williams said as they navigated the afternoon traffic. "I've seen a lot of marksmen in my 15 years, But that was something else entirely. "The kid's not bad," Marcus replied, deflecting the compliment with characteristic modesty. "He's got the fundamentals down, and more importantly, he's got the attitude to learn. That's worth more than natural talent in the long run." "Think he'll still want to enlist after today?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I hope so. But if he does, it'll be for the right reasons. He won't go in thinking he knows everything anymore, and that might save his life someday." Back at the recruitment fair, word of the demonstration had spread like wildfire. The shooting range owner had called ahead with the results, and by the time the cars pulled into the parking lot, a crowd was waiting to hear first-hand accounts of what had transpired. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always do, but even the most exaggerated versions couldn't capture the clinical precision that the witnesses had observed. Jake emerged from his friend's car looking like a boxer who had just gone 12 rounds with a heavyweight champion. He was physically unharmed but mentally reeling from the experience. His carefully constructed self-image as a superior marksman had been demolished so thoroughly that he was having trouble understanding who he was without it. Marcus approached him as the crowd began to disperse, his manner friendly but serious. "Can we talk for a minute?" Jake nodded, following Marcus to a quiet area away from the booths and curious onlookers. Sarah watched from a distance, recognizing the moment when her father shifted from demonstration mode into teaching mode. She had seen it countless times when he helped her with difficult problems, the same patient intensity that he brought to everything he considered important. "First thing I want you to know," Marcus began, "is that you've got real skill with a rifle. That's not something I say lightly. Most people who think they can shoot couldn't have put 5 rounds on paper at that distance under pressure." Jake looked up, surprised by the genuine praise. "But compared to you, I've had advantages you haven't had." Marcus interrupted gently. 12 years of professional training, thousands of hours of practice, and instructors who knew techniques that most civilian shooters never learn. The question isn't whether you can shoot as well as someone with my background right now. The question is whether you're willing to put in the work to get there. They sat on a bench overlooking the parking lot, where families were helping their teenagers gather information from the various military branches. The scene was peaceful, almost pastoral, a stark contrast to the intensity of the shooting demonstration. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said after a long pause. "Sure. How did you do that? I mean, I've been shooting my whole life, and I've never seen anything like what you did. It was like the rifle was part of you." Marcus smiled, and this time there was warmth in the expression. "That's exactly what it was like. When you've fired as many rounds as I have, the weapon becomes an extension of your body. You don't think about sight alignment or trigger control any more than you think about walking or breathing. It becomes instinct." "How many rounds? Conservatively?" "Probably close to 1,000,000 over my career, maybe more. We trained constantly, and ammunition was never a constraint when it came to maintaining our skills." Jake's eyes widened at the number. 1,000,000 rounds? SEALs train differently than most military units. We have higher standards because the missions we undertake don't allow for anything less than perfection. When you're operating behind enemy lines with no backup, every shot has to count. There's no margin for error. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Williams, who approached with obvious respect for Marcus and curiosity about Jake's state of mind. "Mind if I join you?" Marcus gestured to an empty space on the bench. Jake was asking about the training differences between civilian and military shooting. Williams settled onto the bench and studied Jake's face. "It's a common misconception that shooting is shooting. Civilian marksmanship is about accuracy under controlled conditions. Military marksmanship is about effectiveness under the worst possible circumstances. Different goals, different methods." "What do you mean?" Jake asked. "Well," Williams continued, "when you were shooting today, what were you thinking about?" Jake considered the question. "Sight alignment, breathing, trigger squeeze, the basics my dad taught me." "Good fundamentals," Williams agreed. "But that's precision shooting. Combat shooting is about getting hits fast enough to survive. You might be shooting while moving, or while being shot at, or after you've been awake for 36 hours straight. The pretty groupings matter less than putting rounds where they need to go when it counts." Marcus nodded. "The demonstration today was just marksmanship. Real military shooting involves a dozen other skills: target identification, range estimation, wind reading, shooting from improvised positions, engaging multiple targets in priority order, and all of that while carrying 60 pounds of gear and operating on 3 hours of sleep. Jake listened intently, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine curiosity. "Is that what they teach you in SEAL training?" "Among other things," Marcus replied, "but the shooting is just one small part of it. You learn navigation, demolitions, close quarters combat, underwater operations, parachuting, medical training, foreign languages. The idea is to create operators who can handle any situation they might encounter." "What's the hardest part?" Marcus and Williams exchanged glances, both veterans understanding the complexity of that question. "The hardest part isn't physical," Marcus said finally. "It's mental. Learning to make life and death decisions under extreme stress, often with incomplete information and lives depending on your choice. The shooting, the swimming, the running, those are just tools. The real challenge is developing the judgment to use those tools effectively." As the afternoon wore on, the recruitment fair began to wind down. Families gathered their informational packets and business cards, teenagers compared notes about which branches seemed most appealing, and recruiters began the process of following up with serious prospects. But around the bench where Marcus, Jake, and Sergeant Williams sat, a different kind of recruitment was taking place. "I want to apologize for earlier," Jake said suddenly. "I was disrespectful to you, Sergeant Williams, and I was talking about things I don't really understand." Williams waved off the apology. "Trust me, you're not the first teenager to overestimate their readiness for military service. At least you're man enough to admit when you're wrong. That's actually a good sign. The thing is," Jake continued, "I still want to serve. Maybe even more now than before. But I want to do it right. I want to actually be good at it, not just think I'm good at it." Marcus studied the young man's face, seeing something he recognized from his own early days in the Navy. "What changed your mind?" Jake thought about the question for a long moment. "Watching you shoot was like watching someone speak a language I thought I knew, but realizing I only knew a few words. There's so much more to learn than I ever imagined. And if there are people out there who are that good, then I want to be that good too." "It's not easy," Williams warned. "The dropout rate for special operations training is around 80%. Most people who try don't make it." Why do most people fail?" "Different reasons," Marcus answered. "Some aren't physically prepared, even though they think they are. Some can't handle the mental pressure. Some just don't have the commitment it takes to push through when everything in their body is telling them to quit. But some do make it. Yes, some do. The ones who understand that it's not about being the best when you start. It's about being willing to become the best, no matter what it takes." Sarah appeared as the conversation continued, having waited patiently for her father to finish what she recognized as an important teaching moment. "Dad, they're starting to close up the booths." Marcus checked his watch, surprised to discover how much time had passed. "We should probably head home." Jake stood up as well, extending his hand to Marcus. "Thank you for today. I learned more in the last 2 hours than I did in the previous 2 years." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firmness of the grip and the direct eye contact. "You've got the right attitude now." "That's the most important part. Everything else can be taught." As they walked back toward the parking area, Jake fell into step beside Sergeant Williams. "What would you recommend for someone in my position? How should I prepare if I really want to try for special operations?" Williams pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. "First, focus on getting in the best shape of your life. Not just strength, but endurance, mental toughness, swimming ability. Second, work on your shooting fundamentals every chance you get. Third, read everything you can about military history and tactics. And fourth, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons." What are the right reasons? Service. The desire to be part of something bigger than yourself. The willingness to sacrifice for others. If you're doing it for glory or to prove how tough you are, you won't last a week. They reached the cars, where other families were saying their goodbyes and making plans for follow-up visits to local recruiting stations. The atmosphere was hopeful, filled with the dreams and ambitions of young people ready to take the next step in their lives. Marcus turned to Jake one final time. If you decide to move forward with this, remember what you learned today. Not the shooting lesson, but the bigger lesson, which is that confidence without competence is dangerous, but competence without confidence is useless. Your job is to find the balance between the two. Be humble enough to know what you don't know, but bold enough to tackle challenges that scare other people. Jake nodded, understanding that he was receiving advice that went far beyond military service. I will, and thank you again. As Marcus and Sarah drove home, she asked the question that had been on her mind all afternoon. Did you really need to humiliate him like that? Marcus considered his answer carefully. I didn't humiliate him. I educated him. There's a difference. Humiliation would have been calling him out in front of everyone and making fun of his inexperience. Education was showing him the reality of what he was claiming to be ready for. But you could have just told him he was wrong. Words don't teach lessons like experience does. That kid will remember today for the rest of his life. If he decides to pursue special operations, he'll go in with realistic expectations and the humility to learn. If he decides it's not for him, he'll make that choice based on truth rather than fantasy. Either way, he's better off than he was this morning. Sarah thought about that as they drove through the suburbs toward home. Do you think he'll make it if he tries? Maybe. He's got some natural ability, and more importantly, he's got the right attitude now. But natural ability only gets you so far. The rest comes down to how badly you want it and how much you're willing to sacrifice to get there. What about the other guys? His friends seemed pretty shocked by the whole thing. Marcus smiled. They learned something too. They learned that the world is bigger and more complex than they thought. That's not a bad lesson for anyone to learn. That evening, as Marcus sat in his study cleaning his personal firearms, a ritual he had maintained since his first day in the Navy, he reflected on the day's events. The shooting demonstration had been about more than proving a point to an arrogant teenager. It had been about maintaining standards, about ensuring that young people who wanted to serve their country understood the level of commitment and competence that service required. He thought about his own journey from a 19-year-old kid who thought he was tough to a seasoned operator who understood the true meaning of professionalism. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. It had required years of training, countless failures, and the gradual accumulation of skills and wisdom that could only come from experience. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his old teammate Rodriguez, the range owner who had supervised the demonstration. Hell of a thing today, Rodriguez said without preamble. That kid's been calling all evening, wanting to know about training programs and shooting courses. I think you might have created a monster. Marcus laughed. Better a motivated student than an overconfident amateur. True that. You know, watching you shoot again reminded me why I was so glad to have you covering our 6 back in the day. Some skills you just don't lose. Muscle memory is a wonderful thing. It's more than that, though. It's the whole package, the mindset, the preparation, the follow-through. You can teach someone to shoot accurately, but you can't teach them to think like an operator. That comes from somewhere else entirely. After ending the call, Marcus returned to his rifle maintenance, the familiar routine helping him process the day's events. Tomorrow, Jake would wake up and begin the long journey toward understanding what military service really meant. The young man had taken his first step away from adolescent fantasy and toward adult reality, and that was something worth celebrating. Outside his window, the suburban neighborhood settled into its evening routine of dinner preparations and homework supervision. It was the kind of peaceful domesticity that Marcus had fought to protect during his years of service, and seeing it continue undisturbed gave him a deep sense of satisfaction. Young men like Jake would always step forward to defend this way of life, and it was the responsibility of veterans like himself to ensure they were prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. After the shooting demonstration, Marcus received an unexpected phone call that would change the trajectory of not just his life, but the lives of several young people he had encountered at the recruitment fair. The caller was Colonel Patricia Hayes, a Marine Corps officer who ran a specialized pre-military training program for potential special operations candidates. Mr. Sullivan, she began, her voice carrying the crisp authority that Marcus associated with competent field officers. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but Sergeant Williams gave me your contact information. I understand you recently provided some rather eye-opening instruction to a group of potential recruits. Marcus leaned back in his desk chair, curious about where this conversation might lead. I wouldn't call it instruction, Colonel. More like a reality check. That's exactly what I'm calling about. We've been running a pilot program for the past 2 years designed to bridge the gap between civilian expectations and military realities, particularly for young people who are interested in special operations careers. The program, as Colonel Hayes explained it, was a 6-month intensive course that combined physical conditioning, basic military skills, and psychological preparation for the demands of elite military training. It was designed to give potential candidates a realistic preview of what they would face, while also providing them with the tools and knowledge they would need to succeed. The problem we've been facing, Hayes continued, is finding instructors who can teach these skills while also providing the kind of mentorship that helps young people develop the right mindset. Most active duty personnel are too busy with their regular assignments, and many veterans who have the skills lack the patience for teaching. Marcus found himself intrigued despite his initial reluctance. Since retiring from the Navy, he had struggled to find meaningful work that utilized his unique skill set. He had tried various security consulting jobs, but most of them felt pointless compared to the sense of purpose he had experienced during his military career. What exactly would be involved? He asked. We're looking for someone to develop and lead our marksmanship and tactical awareness curriculum. It would involve teaching practical shooting skills, but more importantly, helping these young people understand the mental aspects of combat operations. Based on what I'd heard about your recent demonstration, you seem to have exactly the combination of technical expertise and teaching ability we need. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which Hayes outlined the program's goals, structure, and the type of students it attracted. Most were college-age men and women who had already committed to military service but wanted additional preparation before entering formal training programs. Some were hoping to qualify for special operations units, while others simply wanted to excel in whatever role the military assigned them. I'll need to think about it, Marcus said finally. Of course, but before you decide, I'd like you to meet some of our current students. We have a session scheduled for this weekend at Camp Pendleton. Would you be willing to observe and maybe provide some input on our current curriculum? Marcus agreed to the visit, partly out of curiosity and partly because he had been impressed by Hayes's obvious competence and dedication. The program she described sounded like something that could make a real difference in the lives of young service members, and after years of feeling disconnected from meaningful work, the opportunity was appealing. That evening, he called Jake to check on the young man's progress since the recruitment fair. The change in Jake's voice was immediately apparent. Gone was the cocky swagger, replaced by a more mature tone that suggested serious thought and preparation. Sullivan, Jake said, clearly surprised but pleased to hear from him. I'm glad you called. I wanted to thank you again for what you taught me that day. How have you been spending your time since then? Well, I started working with a trainer at the gym that Sergeant Williams recommended. Turns out, I'm in nowhere near as good shape as I thought I was, and I've been reading everything I can find about military history and tactics. Marcus was pleased to hear the young man taking such a methodical approach to his preparation. What have you learned so far? That I don't know anything, Jake laughed, but there was no bitterness in it. I mean, I thought I understood what military service was about, but reading about actual combat operations and training programs has been a real eye-opener. It's like you said. There's so much more to it than I ever imagined. Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Jake asking thoughtful questions about everything from physical preparation to the psychological demands of military service. Marcus found himself enjoying the role of mentor, something he had missed since leaving active duty. Actually, Marcus said as the call was winding down, "There's something you might be interested in. I've been contacted about a pre-military training program that might be perfect for someone in your position." He explained Colonel Hayes's program, watching Jake's enthusiasm build as he described the curriculum and goals. By the end of the explanation, the young man was clearly excited about the possibility. Do you think I'd be a good fit for something like that? Based on our conversations tonight, I think you've developed exactly the kind of mindset they're looking for. You're motivated, you're realistic about the challenges ahead, and you're willing to put in the work. That's more important than any particular skill level. The weekend visit to Camp Pendleton proved to be even more interesting than Marcus had anticipated. The program operated out of a cluster of temporary buildings near the main base, with access to a variety of training facilities including shooting ranges, obstacle courses, and classroom spaces. The students he met were a diverse group of 18 to 22-year-olds, all of whom had demonstrated both the intelligence and motivation needed for advanced military training. Colonel Hayes introduced him to Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a Force Recon Marine who served as the program's senior instructor. She was a compact woman in her early 30s with the kind of quiet confidence that Marcus associated with proven combat veterans. "We've been following a pretty standard curriculum," Rodriguez explained as they walked through the facilities. "Physical training in the morning, classroom work in the afternoon, practical skills in the evening. But we've been struggling with the marksmanship component. Most of our students come in thinking they know how to shoot, and it takes weeks to break down their bad habits before we can build up proper skills."
Marcus nodded, remembering his own early experiences with military marksmanship training.
"What kind of equipment are you working with?" "Standard M4s, some M16A4s for precision work, and a few specialized weapons for advanced students. We've got access to ranges from 25 yards out to 600 yards, plus a shoot house for close quarters training." The afternoon observation session gave Marcus a clear picture of both the program's strengths and its challenges. The students were clearly motivated and intelligent, but their civilian shooting backgrounds had indeed created habits that worked against military effectiveness. He watched one young woman struggle to engage multiple targets quickly because she was trying to achieve perfect sight alignment for each shot, and a young man who couldn't seem to break the habit of taking long, deliberate aim even when speed was more important than precision. During a break in the training, Marcus found himself talking with several of the students about their goals and motivations. Their stories were remarkably similar to Jake's. Young people who had grown up with romanticized notions of military service but who were beginning to understand the complexity of what they had committed to. "The hardest part," said a 20-year-old named Ashley who hoped to become a Marine Corps pilot, "is unlearning everything I thought I knew. I've been shooting competitively since middle school, but apparently competitive shooting and combat shooting are completely different things." A young man named Carlos, whose goal was Army Special Forces, nodded in agreement. "I thought I was tough because I played football and could bench press a lot of weight, but this program has shown me that mental toughness is completely different from physical strength." After observing the afternoon session, Marcus met with Colonel Hayes and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez to discuss his impressions. His feedback was direct but constructive, focusing on ways to accelerate the transition from civilian to military mindset without destroying the students' confidence. "The technical skills are important," he said, "but the real challenge is teaching them to think differently about problem solving. Civilian shooting is about perfection, making the best possible shot every time. Military shooting is about effectiveness, making good enough shots fast enough to accomplish the mission." Hayes leaned forward, clearly interested in his perspective. "How would you approach that differently? Start with the why before you get to the how. Instead of just teaching them to shoot faster, teach them to understand when fast matters more than perfect. Give them scenarios where they have to make real decisions under pressure, not just follow predetermined drills." The discussion continued for another 2 hours, covering everything from curriculum design to assessment methods. Marcus found himself increasingly interested in the program, not just as a job opportunity, but as a chance to make a meaningful contribution to the next generation of military personnel. "I have a proposal," he said finally. "Let me work with your current group for 2 weeks as a trial run. I'll develop some lesson plans that incorporate scenario-based training and realistic decision-making exercises. If the results are positive, we can talk about a longer-term arrangement." Hayes and Rodriguez exchanged glances, both clearly pleased with the suggestion. "That sounds perfect," Hayes said. "When can you start?" As it turned out, Marcus's trial period coincided with Jake's application to the program. The young man had submitted his paperwork the day after their phone conversation, and had been accepted based on his strong academic record and the recommendation letters from both Marcus and Sergeant Williams. Jake's arrival at Camp Pendleton marked the beginning of what would become the most rewarding professional experience of Marcus's post-military career. Working with Jake and the other students, he began to develop training methods that combined technical skill development with the kind of psychological preparation that would serve them throughout their military careers. The breakthrough came during the second week, when Marcus introduced what he called decision drills, exercises that required students to make tactical choices under time pressure, while also demonstrating technical proficiency. Instead of just shooting at static targets, students had to identify threats, prioritize targets, and engage them in appropriate sequence while dealing with various stressors like time limits, physical fatigue, and simulated equipment failures. Jake thrived in this environment, his natural competitiveness channeled into productive learning rather than empty boasting. Marcus watched him evolve from the overconfident teenager he had met at the recruitment fair into a focused young adult who understood the difference between confidence and arrogance. "The thing that's different about training here," Jake told his parents during a weekend visit home, "is that they don't just teach you what to do. They teach you how to think about what you're doing. Every exercise has a purpose, and they make sure you understand not just the technique, but the reasoning behind it." His transformation was representative of what was happening with the entire group. Students who had arrived thinking they were already prepared for military service were discovering new levels of capability they hadn't known they possessed. More importantly, they were developing the kind of adaptive thinking that would serve them well in the unpredictable environment of actual military operations. The success of Marcus's approach caught the attention of senior leadership at Camp Pendleton, and by the end of his trial period he had been invited to address a gathering of training officers from across the Marine Corps. His presentation, focused on the integration of technical skills training with tactical decision-making, was well received and led to requests for similar programs at other installations. "What you've created here," Colonel Hayes told him at the end of the 2-week trial, "is exactly what we've been looking for. You're not just teaching these kids to shoot better, you're teaching them to think like warriors." Marcus accepted the permanent position, but with one condition. He wanted to expand the program to include not just marksmanship, but comprehensive tactical awareness training. His vision was to create a curriculum that would prepare students not just for the technical demands of military service, but for the mental and emotional challenges they would face as leaders and decision-makers. The expanded program launched 3 months later, with Jake among the first graduates. The young man who had once boasted about his shooting skills while knowing nothing about the realities of military service had become a confident, competent candidate who understood both his capabilities and his limitations. On graduation day, as Marcus watched Jake and his classmates receive their certificates, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The shooting demonstration at the recruitment fair had been intended as a simple lesson in humility. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a new career that combined his military expertise with his natural teaching ability. "You know," Jake said as they shook hands after the ceremony, "that day at the recruitment fair was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because you showed me how much I didn't know, but because you showed me that there was so much more to learn. That made all the difference." Marcus smiled, understanding that the young man had learned the most important lesson of all, that true confidence comes not from thinking you know everything, but from being excited about everything you don't know yet. 2 years after the expanded program launched, Marcus found himself standing in a very different setting than the suburban recruitment fair where his teaching career had begun. He was now addressing a packed auditorium at the Naval War College, speaking to an audience of senior military officers, defense contractors, and educational researchers about the evolution of pre-military training programs. The success of his program at Camp Pendleton had exceeded everyone's expectations. Graduates were performing exceptionally well in their subsequent military training, with pass rates for special operations programs nearly double the national average. More importantly, they were demonstrating the kind of adaptive thinking and leadership potential that suggested long, successful military careers. Jake, now a Navy SEAL candidate in his final phase of training, sat in the front row of the auditorium. His transformation from the cocky teenager who had challenged military marksmanship standards to a mature young warrior was complete. But more than that, he had become living proof of what was possible when proper preparation met genuine motivation. The traditional model of military training, Marcus explained to his audience, assumes that we can take any reasonably intelligent, physically capable young person and transform them into an effective service member through standardized instruction. And to a large extent that's true. But what we've learned through our program is that we can dramatically improve outcomes by addressing the psychological and conceptual preparation before formal training begins. The presentation covered 3 years of data and analysis, but the heart of Marcus's message was simple. Young people performed better when they understood not just what they were being asked to do, but why it mattered and how it connected to larger purposes. The shooting demonstration that had started everything was now just one small part of a comprehensive curriculum that covered everything from decision-making under pressure to the ethical dimensions of military service. After the presentation, Marcus was approached by Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher from MIT who had been studying military training effectiveness. Your program represents a fundamental shift in how we think about preparation for high-stress careers, she said. Have you considered expanding the model beyond military applications? The conversation that followed planted a seed that would eventually grow into Marcus's next major project. Dr. Chen was part of a team developing training programs for first responders, and she believed that the principles Marcus had developed could be adapted for police officers, firefighters, and emergency medical personnel. The core challenge is the same, she explained over coffee after the conference. How do you prepare someone for situations where split-second decisions can mean the difference between life and death? Traditional training focuses on procedures and protocols, but what you've developed addresses the underlying cognitive and emotional skills that make someone effective in crisis situations. Marcus was intrigued but cautious. Military training has some advantages that civilian training doesn't. We have total control over the environment, unlimited time for preparation, and students who have already made a commitment to the lifestyle. First responders have to balance training with ongoing operational responsibilities. True, but they also have the advantage of working in their actual operational environment rather than trying to simulate it. That could make the training even more realistic and effective. The discussion continued for several hours, ranging across topics from neuroscience research on decision-making under stress to the practical challenges of implementing new training methodologies in established organizations. By the end of the conversation, Marcus had agreed to collaborate on a pilot program for a major metropolitan police department. Meanwhile, Jake's progress through SEAL training had become a source of pride not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had been part of the original program. The young man's instructors reported that he demonstrated exactly the kind of balanced confidence and adaptive thinking that made for successful special operations personnel. He was technically proficient but not rigid, confident but not arrogant, and most importantly, focused on team success rather than personal glory. During a brief training break, Jake called Marcus to share news of his progress and to seek advice about the challenges he was facing. The physical stuff is hard, but it's what I expected, he said. The mental challenges are different than what I thought they'd be. It's not just about being tough. It's about staying focused and making good decisions when everything around you is chaos. Marcus smiled, recognizing the voice of someone who was beginning to understand the true nature of elite military service. What's the hardest part? Learning to trust my training and my teammates completely. When things get intense, your brain wants to overthink everything or to try to control things you can't control. The guys who wash out are usually the ones who can't let go and trust the process. That's exactly right. And the fact that you recognize it means you're developing the kind of self-awareness that will serve you well throughout your career. Their conversation was interrupted by Jake's training schedule, but as Marcus hung up the phone, he reflected on how far the young man had come since that day at the recruitment fair. The arrogant teenager who had believed his hunting experience qualified him for military service had become a thoughtful adult who understood that true competence required constant learning and adaptation. The police training pilot program launched 6 months later in a major East Coast city that had been struggling with officer-involved shooting incidents. The department's leadership, under pressure to improve training outcomes, had agreed to try Marcus's approach with a small group of veteran officers and new recruits. The initial sessions were challenging in ways that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Unlike military trainees, who came into the program with a shared understanding of hierarchy and mission, police officers brought diverse backgrounds and varying levels of commitment to new training methodologies. Some embraced the scenario-based approach enthusiastically, while others were skeptical of anything that differed from traditional firearms training. The breakthrough came during the third week, when Marcus introduced a simulation that required officers to make split-second decisions about using force while dealing with incomplete information and civilian safety concerns. The exercise was based on an actual incident that had occurred in the city, but with the participants unaware of the real-world connection. Officer Jennifer Walsh, a 10-year veteran who had initially been skeptical of the program, found herself in a simulated domestic violence call that escalated rapidly when the suspect suddenly reached for what appeared to be a weapon. In the high-stress environment of the simulation, she had to decide whether to shoot while also considering the presence of children in the room and the possibility that the object in the suspect's hand might not actually be a gun. Her decision to move to cover while calling for backup rather than immediately using deadly force proved correct when the weapon was revealed to be a cell phone. But more importantly, her reasoning process demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical thinking that could prevent tragedies in real-world situations. "I've been through dozens of training scenarios over the years," Walsh said during the debrief, "but this was the first time I felt like I was being trained to think rather than just to follow procedures." The technical skills are important, but in real situations, you need to be able to adapt and make decisions based on what's actually happening, not just what you planned for. The success of the police pilot program led to expansion into other first responder fields, and within a year, Marcus found himself consulting with fire departments, emergency medical services, and even civilian security firms. Each application required adaptation of his core principles to different operational environments, but the fundamental approach remained the same. Combine technical skill development with realistic decision-making training under stress. The growth of his training programs also created an opportunity to bring Jake into the organization as an instructor. After successfully completing SEAL training and his first deployment, the young man had developed into exactly the kind of operator that Marcus had envisioned during their early conversations. His combination of technical competence, tactical thinking, and teaching ability made him a natural fit for the expanding program. "I keep thinking about that day at the recruitment fair," Jake said during one of their planning sessions for a new curriculum module. "If you had just walked away instead of challenging me, my whole life would have been different. I probably would have gone into the military with all my misconceptions intact and washed out of training within a few weeks." Marcus shook his head. "You would have figured it out eventually. Maybe it would have taken longer and been more painful, but you had the raw material to become what you've become. The training just helped you get there more efficiently." "Maybe, but I think there's something more important than that. You taught me that being wrong about something isn't a failure if you're willing to learn from it. That's been more valuable than any technical skill." Their conversation was part of a larger discussion about the future direction of the training programs. Success had brought attention from military leadership, law enforcement organizations, and private sector companies, all of whom wanted to implement similar approaches in their own training curricula. The challenge was maintaining quality and consistency while scaling up to meet demand. The solution came in the form of a training institute that combined residential programs with distance learning modules and certification processes for instructors. Marcus found himself at the head of an organization that employed dozens of military veterans and subject matter experts, all working to prepare the next generation of people who would serve in high-stakes professions. The Institute's flagship program remained the pre-military course that had started everything, now expanded to serve potential candidates for all branches of the armed forces. Jake had become the lead instructor for the program, bringing his unique perspective as someone who had literally lived the transformation from overconfident civilian to competent professional. During the Institute's third annual graduation ceremony, Marcus stood before an audience of students, families, and distinguished guests, reflecting on the journey that had brought them all together. The event was being held at the same community college where the original recruitment fair had taken place, a deliberate choice that emphasized the importance of remembering where the journey had begun. 3 years ago, he told the assembled crowd, "I met a young man who thought he knew everything about military service because he was good at hunting. Today, that same young man is one of our nation's elite warriors and one of this institute's most effective instructors." His transformation illustrates something fundamental about human potential. We all have capabilities that we haven't discovered yet, but realizing that potential requires the humility to acknowledge what we don't know and the determination to learn from our mistakes. Jake, now wearing the uniform of a Navy SEAL and the confident bearing of someone who had proven himself in the most demanding circumstances, smiled at the reference to their first meeting. In the audience, his parents sat with tears in their eyes, proud of the man their son had become, but also grateful for the mentor who had helped guide his transformation. After the ceremony, as families celebrated and graduates prepared for the next phase of their journeys, Marcus found himself in conversation with a young woman who reminded him of Jake at his most arrogant. She had just completed the program with distinction, but still carried herself with the kind of confidence that bordered on cockiness. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "I want to thank you for everything I've learned here. But I have to ask, do you really think all this psychological stuff is necessary? I mean, if you have good technical skills and you're in good physical shape, isn't that enough?" Marcus smiled, recognizing the question as one that every generation of students eventually asked. "Let me tell you about a young man I met a few years ago who asked a very similar question. As he began to tell the story of Jake's transformation, Marcus realized that the cycle was beginning again. New students would arrive with their misconceptions and overconfidence, encounter challenges that revealed the gaps in their understanding, and hopefully develop into the kind of professionals that society needed. Some would thrive, others would struggle, but all would be better prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. The shooting demonstration that had started everything was now just one small part of a much larger story about the power of good teaching, the importance of realistic preparation, and the endless potential that exists within people who are willing to acknowledge their limitations and work to overcome them. But at its heart, it remained a story about the moment when confidence met competence, and both were transformed in the process. Jake approached as the conversation with the new student concluded, his easy confidence a stark contrast to the nervous arrogance he had displayed years earlier. "Ready for the next group?" he asked. Marcus nodded, looking out at the parking lot where families were loading cars with graduation certificates and memories of a significant milestone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to make a difference in young lives. "Always," he replied. "The work never ends, but that's what makes it worthwhile." As they walked toward their cars, instructor and former student, now colleagues in the vital work of preparing others for service, Marcus reflected on the unexpected path that had led him from retired warrior to educator and mentor. The demonstration that had been intended to teach one arrogant teenager a lesson about humility had become the foundation for a program that was changing lives and improving the effectiveness of those who served in dangerous professions. It was, he thought with satisfaction, exactly the kind of mission that had drawn him to military service in the first place. The opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of others and in the security and safety of the community he had sworn to protect. The uniform had changed, and the battlefield was now a classroom, but the core purpose remained the same: preparing others to meet whatever challenges lay ahead with competence, confidence, and the wisdom that comes from understanding both one's capabilities and limitations.